For many years, I was regarded as an alien. Since I was a foreign-born person who was not a U.S. citizen, but was legally recorded as a resident of the country, I was labeled as a resident alien. As a child, I couldn't understand why I was designated that way. Where I came from, we had coconut trees and beautiful beaches. Sure, we ate mangoes and plenty of fish, but why that made me an alien was beyond my comprehension as a 10-year-old boy who had just arrived on these strange shores of the United States of America. It is estimated that more than 1 million resident aliens arrive in the U.S. each year. These foreign-born individuals are lawfully recognized as residents of the country and allowed to live and work even though they are not U.S. citizens. As legal immigrants, they must have a green card or pass a substantial presence test. They are also subject to the same taxes as other U.S. citizens. There are other terms that may be used to identify the status of a resident alien. The following identifications, which are more precise and politically correct, are used interchangeably: legal immigrant, permanent resident, or green card holder. In 2018, there were about 44.8 million legal immigrants living in the U.S. Approximately 1 in 7 U.S. residents was foreign-born. While an exact number is impossible to determine, the number of undocumented immigrants living in the U.S. ranged from 10.5 to 12 million in 2019. Undocumented immigrants or foreign-born people who do not possess a valid visa or other immigration document because they enter the U.S. without inspection, stayed longer than their temporary visa permitted, or otherwise violated the terms under which they were admitted. A person entering or remaining in the U.S. without valid documentation is in violation of federal immigration laws. These folks are often labeled as illegal aliens. In 2016, the Library of Congress announced that it would use non-citizens or unauthorized immigrants as a bibliographical term rather than calling them illegal aliens. This once common designation had become offensive. Unfortunately, this unpleasant identification persists among top politicians and continues to appear in many official documents and government websites. Illegal immigration is a matter of intense debate in the U.S. and in many parts of the world. How should Christians respond to this extremely controversial and a volatile issue? Intriguingly, there is fervent claim of biblical support on both sides. The immigration debate is complex. Among the many issues involved, two are most contentious. First, those who immigrate to the U.S., for example, without going through the proper legal channels, are here illegally and therefore are illegal immigrants. According to some, these people should be labeled as such and not the euphemistic undocumented immigrants. Furthermore, these immigrants should have no expectations that their lives here should be the same as those who are legal citizens. They broke the law to come here and should expect to be deported by the Office of the Immigration and Custom Enforcement, known as ICE. This side of the debate strongly advocates for immigration reform that would not favor a path to legal status and citizenship for illegal or undocumented immigrants. Second, the immigration debate centers on the issue of borders. There are those who advocate for an open border policy, fully or conditionally. The U.S. is a nation built by immigrants. A core American value is that everyone has a chance to succeed because as long as you work hard, you will find a place in this country. Constructing a wall at the border denies this basic principle and is therefore un-American. Opponents of fully open borders have argued that this view is crazy and senseless. In January 2017, the U.S. government signed 2 executive orders related to immigration and border security, moving ahead with the plans to build a wall along the U.S. border with Mexico and to deport people who were in the country illegally. This view is based on the typical image of immigrants sneaking across the U.S.-Mexican border. But only about half of the undocumented immigrants arrive this way. The other half, less noted and rarely making the headline news, arrive legally, typically on work, tourist, or student visas, but then overstay their visa status. National sovereignty is the heart of the immigration debate. For many Christians, the idea of a sovereign nation enforcing its own immigration policy and protecting its borders does not contradict the teaching of Scripture. Proponents of this position usually turn to Romans chapter 13, verse 1 to 2, or 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 11 to 14. These 2 texts basically teach that Christians should obey the laws of a sovereign nation. Thus, supporting, enabling, and/or encouraging illegal immigration is a violation of God's Word. Interestingly, the Church does not oppose the right of sovereign nations to control their borders and territories. However, it also recognizes the right of people to migrate when it is necessary. The pastoral letter concerning migration from the Catholic bishops of Mexico and the U.S., known as Strangers No Longer, Together on the Journey of Hope, came out in 2003. It states, "The Church recognizes the right of a foreign state to control its borders in furtherance of the common good. It also recognizes the right of human persons to migrate so that they can realize their own God-given rights. These teachings complement each other. While the sovereign state may impose reasonable limits on immigration, the common good is not served when the basic human rights of the individual are violated." Realizing the danger of branding all undocumented immigrants as rapists or drug traffickers, Pope Francis called on the U.S. and the world to adopt a humanitarian approach to those crossing borders, especially children. The Pope said at a global conference in Mexico in 2014, "Many people forced to immigrate suffer and often die tragically. Many of their rights are violated. They are obligated to separate from their families and, unfortunately, continue to be the subject of racist and xenophobic attitudes." The Pope was keenly aware that stereotypes and myths about immigrants perpetuate xenophobic attitudes and are often used as a basis for political decisions around the issues of legal and illegal immigration. Stereotypes and myths about migration do greatly influence people's views. These myths can heighten xenophobic and cause tension, violence, and unrest. There are many myths about undocumented immigrants. Among the most notable ones are, they are overrunning the country, they steal jobs, they drain the country's social assistance, education, and healthcare services, they don't pay taxes, and building a wall across the border will stop illegals and terrorists from entering the U.S. Facts have shown that these views are pure myths and are not true. Research has shown that undocumented immigrants contribute to economic growth, enhance the welfare of the natives, pay more in tax revenue than they collect, and benefit consumers by reducing the prices of goods and services. Statistics have indicated that immigrants commit less crime than natives. Misconceptions and myths have greatly fueled xenophobia, a fear or hatred of anything strange or foreign, particularly as it relates to people. Anti-immigrant rhetoric and movements are on the rise around the world. For the most part, the Bible is quite favorable towards immigrants. The authors of the Bible overwhelmingly demand a pro-immigrant stance. This position is most forthright in Israel's laws. Throughout the Old Testament, legal teaching, the Israelites are constantly reminded to care for the strangers, migrants, and refugees because they were once foreigners in the land of Egypt. The author of Deuteronomy exalts, "For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who is not partial and takes no bribe, who executes justice for the orphan and the widow, and who loves the strangers, providing them food and clothing. You shall also love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt." The book of Leviticus issues a similar commandment. "When an alien resides with you in your land, you shall not oppress the alien. The alien who resides with you shall be to you as the citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God." In general, the laws of the Old Testament were uniquely gracious to immigrants because no other ancient Near Eastern law codes has such instructions. The incentive or motivation to care for the strangers must have come from Israel's collective memory of how God had cared for them when they were estranged, oppressed, and vulnerable. Israel, too, was to love strangers, migrants, and refugees because God does. Neglecting justice for this people is a sin. The biblical command of being kind to immigrants is also binding today. Everyone is responsible to uphold the sacred directive, from individuals to institutions to society as a whole. This ethical mandate should especially resonate with us Christians. How should Christians respond to illegal or undocumented immigrants? The same way we respond to anything else, with mercy and love. Quoting the prophet Hosea, Jesus said, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice." Another of his famous dictums was, "Be merciful just as your Father is merciful." If you want to see the face of God, just examine Jesus' words and actions. Jesus is the face of God's mercy. At an Easter address, an apostolic blessing known as Ubi et Orbi in the city and the world, Pope Francis said, "God's mercy can make even the driest land become a garden, can restore life to dry bones. Let us be renewed by God's mercy. Let us be loved by Jesus. Let us enable the power of His love to transform our lives too. And let us become agents of this mercy, channels through which God can water the earth, protect all creation, and make justice and peace flourish. Mercy is love. Pope St. John Paul II said it so eloquently. Mercy is really love transformed. So we need to understand what love is if we are to penetrate more deeply into what it means to be merciful. We are familiar with St. Paul's famous hymn of love in 1 Corinthians. If I speak in the tongues of mortals and of angels, but do not have love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I'm nothing. The author of the letters of John also exhorted his fellow Christians, saying, Beloved, let us love one another, because love is from God. Everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, for God is love. Jesus Christ defines love in concrete actions, namely, when you feed the hungry, give water to the thirsty, welcome a stranger, clothe the naked, care for the sick, or visit the prisoner. Truly I tell you, Jesus said, just as you did it to one of the least of these, who are members of my family, you did it to me. In short, both testaments call for a more demanding love of those whom we otherwise would consider outsiders.
Do you want to fall in love with God? I'm sure we all want to. The book of Psalms contains the directions. Thousands of years ago, people like you and me talked to God out of the depths of their hearts, revealing an intimate love. Psalms are the expression of the faith in God by people around 3,000 years ago. God was not a mere abstract creator, but was present, involved, and a real person of power and emotions. Now, when we read or listen to the Psalms, we can know the intensity of this love. Entering into the influence of the Psalms, we can find a path to know and love God. To know more about the Psalms, you should get a copy of Father Mike Manning's booklet, The Psalms. It will help you to understand the 150 Psalms better as he has categorized them. He uses the technique of acts: adoration, contrition, thanksgiving, and supplication. Get your copy today and know the categories. Learn to pray with the Psalms.
Call the number on the screen or email us. You can also get it through our website. Get your copy today.
Life as an immigrant is no joke. An immigrant is vulnerable, relying always on the generosity of others and on the whims of nature. Realizing that life is but a sojourn should cause us to be more sympathetic with those immigrants who are displaced from their home and trapped at the borders. The Bible addresses this issue explicitly. The first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis are filled with stories of forced and voluntary migration. Due to pride and selfishness, namely wanting to be like God, Adam and Eve disobeyed God's commands and consequently were expelled from the Garden of Eden. They barely had time to enjoy the fruits and sanctuary of paradise provided by God. Interestingly, however, before the first parents were exiled to earth to secure their own shelter and till the land for food, God showed deep affection and concern for these earliest sojourners by sewing skins together to clothe them and protect them from the elements. The theme of alienation and displacement continues with Cain, who kills his brother Abel out of jealousy. As a punishment, he becomes a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. As the inhabitants of the earth increase, wickedness, violence, and degradation of the earth sickens God to the point of regret for having created humanity. Thus, God purges the earth and all its inhabitants with a huge flood. Noah and his family, who were righteous before God and chosen to continue the human race, were forced to flee their land because of this tragedy. Like many victims of natural disasters, they became immigrants without a known destination. Nevertheless, trusting in the covenant promised by God, Noah sails over the waves of fear and chaos to find a new home on a distant shore. But that's not the end. The Tower of Babel presents another tale about forced migration. In this story, the whole humanity decides to challenge God by constructing a tower that would reach heaven. For their sin of pride, God confuses the language of all the inhabitants and scatters them throughout the face of the earth. In short, the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis recount tales of the earliest human families as migrants and refugees, moving about the earth, seeking a land to settle and a home in which to dwell. What is most noticeable in these accounts is that God cares for and protects these fugitives, vagrants, or migrants despite their shortcomings. Israel's memory of their founding ancestors is fundamentally as Gerim, a Hebrew designation that can be loosely translated as resident aliens, strangers, sojourners, or more appropriately, immigrants. Abraham even describes himself as an immigrant or ger. The patriarchs are also referred to collectively as Gerim, when God declares to Moses that he had promised to give them the land in which they were to dwell as outsiders. Even the psalmist refers to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as Gerim, who wander about Canaan before their descendants took possession of the land at a later time. And the two other instances, Psalm 39 and 1 Chronicles 29, Israel's ancestors are called Gerim, immigrants. Not surprisingly, the Israelites were commanded to always remember their sojourning heritage when they enter the Promised Land and harvest the fruits of the earth. They are to recall, saying, "My father was a refugee Aramean who went down to Egypt with a small household and lived there as a resident alien. But there he became a great nation, strong and numerous." We learn from these ancestral stories that even though these immigrants are vulnerable, frail, and even sinful, they are not nameless and faceless, but rather are created in the image and likeness of God. They are human beings and should be treated with the dignity that has been divinely bestowed upon them. Often those who show kindness to these folks do not go unnoticed and are rewarded abundantly. Consequently, biblical writers continue to remind their readers to treat the strangers and immigrants in their midst with respect and dignity. For to neglect the needs of these vulnerable migrants make one liable to punishment. In the New Testament, Jesus is consistently portrayed as a stranger, guest, host, and even as food. Such depictions of Jesus highlight the virtue of hospitality. Jesus teaches that when someone feeds the hungry, gives water to the thirsty, clothes the naked, cares for the sick, and visits the prisoner, in other words, welcomes a stranger, he or she does it for Christ himself. The letter to the Hebrews states, "Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares." In another letter, Peter exhorts his fellow Christians, saying, "Practice hospitality ungrudgingly to one another." Accordingly, hospitality to the stranger is a major pastoral challenge of migration today. Solidarity and welcoming the immigrants in our midst is a Christian moral obligation. It is said that migration is as old as history. While migration is certainly not a new phenomenon, it is nonetheless a major crisis of our epoch. Migration may be defined as a process of moving, either across an international border or within the nation. Migration is a global phenomenon that is growing in scope and complexity, affecting most countries, families, communities, and almost every aspect of modern life. It teaches that when someone feeds the hungry, gives water to the thirsty, clothes the naked, cares for the sick, and visits the prisoner, in other words, welcomes a stranger, he or she does it for Christ himself. The letter to the Hebrews states, "Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares." In another letter, Peter exhorts his fellow Christians, saying, "Practice hospitality ungrudgingly to one another." Accordingly, hospitality to the stranger is a major pastoral challenge of migration today. Solidarity and welcoming the immigrants in our midst is a Christian moral obligation. There are many ways to practice hospitality. We can begin by being generous with and practicing charity toward our friends and neighbors. But we cannot and must not end there. The religious practice of hospitality must go beyond family, acquaintances, and even fellow citizens. Genuine hospitality reaches out to those who we do not yet know, particularly to the immigrants who are in our midst and at our borders. By extending ourselves to these vulnerable ones, we might not only entertain angels, but actually meet God face to face.